Chapter 2. Now, of course, the quality and the seasonability of these winter dreams varied, but the stuff of them remained. They persuaded Dexter several years later to pass up a business course at the State University. His father, prospering now, would have paid his way for the precarious advantage of attending an older and more famous university in the East, where he was bothered by his scanty funds. But do not get the impression, because his winter dreams happened to be concerned at first with musings on the rich, that there was anything merely snobbish in the boy. He wanted not association with glittering things and glittering people. He wanted the glittering things themselves. Often he reached out for the best without knowing why he wanted it. And sometimes he ran up against the mysterious denials and prohibitions in which life indulges. It is with one of those denials and not with his career as a whole that this story deals. He made money. It was rather amazing. After college, he went to the city from which Black Bear Lake draws its wealthy patrons. When he was only 23 and he had been there not quite 2 years, there were already people who liked to say, "Now, there's a boy." All about him, rich men's sons were peddling bonds precariously, or investing patrimonies precariously, or plodding through the dozen volumes of the George Washington commercial course. But Dexter borrowed $1,000 on his college degree and his confident mouth and bought a partnership in a laundry. It was a small laundry when he went into it, but Dexter made a speciality of learning how the English washed fine woolen golf stockings without shrinking them. And within a year, he was catering to the trade that wore knickerbockers. Men were insisting that their Shetland hose and sweaters go to his laundry, just as they had insisted on a caddy who could find golf balls. A little later, he was doing their wives' lingerie as well and running 5 branches in different parts of the city. Before he was 27, he owned the largest string of laundries in his section of the country. It was then that he sold out and went to New York. But the part of his story that concerns us goes back to the days when he was making his first big success. When he was 23, Mr. Hart, one of the gray-haired men who liked to say, "Now there's a boy," gave him a guest card at the Sherry Island Golf Club for a weekend. So he signed his name one day on the register, and that afternoon played a golf in a foursome with Mr. Hart and Mr. Sandwood and Mr. T.A. Hedrick. He did not consider it necessary to remark that he had once carried Mr. Hart's bag over this same links, and that he knew every trap and gully with his eyes shut. But he found himself glancing at the 4 caddies who trailed them, trying to catch a gleam or gesture that would remind him of himself, that would lessen the gap which lay between his present and his past. It was a curious day, splashed abruptly with fleeting, familiar impressions. One minute he had the sense of being a trespasser, and the next he was impressed by the tremendous superiority he felt toward Mr. T.A. Hedrick, who was a bore and not even a good golfer anymore. Then, because of a ball Mr. Hart lost near the 15th green, an enormous thing happened. While they were searching the stiff grasses of the rough, there was a clear call of "Faw!" from behind a hill in their rear. And as they all turned abruptly from their search, a bright new ball sliced abruptly over the hill and caught Mr. T.A. Hedrick in the abdomen. "By God!" cried Mr. T.A. Hedrick. "They ought to put some of these crazy women off the course. It's getting to be outrageous." A head and a voice came up together over the hill. "Do you mind if we go through?" "You hit me in the stomach," declared Mr. Hedrick wildly. "Did I?" The girl approached the group of men. "I'm sorry. I yelled 'for.'" Her glance fell casually on each of the men, then scanned the fairway for her ball. Did I bounce into the rough? It was impossible to determine whether this question was ingenuous or malicious. In a moment, however, she left no doubt, for as her partner came up over the hill, she called cheerfully, "Here I am. I'd have gone on the green except that I hit something." As she took her stance for a short, mashy shot, Dexter looked at her closely. She wore a blue gingham dress, rimmed at throat and shoulders with a white edging that accentuated her tan, the quality of exaggeration of thinness which had made her passionate eyes and down-turning mouth absurd at 11 was gone now. She was arrestingly beautiful. The color in her cheeks were centered like the color in a picture. It was not a high color, but a sun of fluctuating and feverish warmth, so shaded that it seemed at any moment it would recede and disappear. This color and the mobility of her mouth gave a continual impression of flux, of intense life, of passionate vitality, balanced only partially by the sad luxury of her eyes. She swung her mashie impatiently and without interest, pitching the ball into a sandpit on the other side of the green. With a quick, insincere smile and careless "Thank you," she went on after it. "That Judy Jones," remarked Mr. Hedrick on the next tee as they waited some moments, "for her to play on ahead. All she needed is to be turned up and spanked for 6 months, and then to be married off to an old-fashioned cavalry captain." "My God, she's good-looking," said Mr. Sandwood, who was just over 30. "Good-looking," cried Mr. Hendrick contemptuously. "She always looks as if she wanted to be kissed, turning those big cow eyes on every calf in town." It was doubtful if Mr. Hedrick intended a reference to the maternal instinct. "She'd played pretty good golf if she'd tried," said Mr. Sandwood. "She has no form," said Mr. Hedrick solemnly. "She has a nice figure," said Mr. Sandwood. "Better thank the Lord she doesn't drive a swifter ball," said Mr. Hart, winking at Dexter. Later in the afternoon, the sun went down with a righteous swirl of gold. Later in the afternoon, the sun went down with a riotous swirl of gold and varying blues and scarlets, and left the dry, rustling night of western summer. Dexter watched from the veranda of the Gold Club, watched the evening overlap of the waters in the little wind, silver molasses under the harvest moon. Then the moon held a finger to her lips, and the lake became a clear pool, pale and quiet. Dexter put on his bathing suit and swam out to the farthest raft, where he stretched, dripping on the wet canvas of the springboard. There was a fish jumping and a star shining, and the lights around the lake were gleaming. Over on the dark peninsula, a piano was playing the songs of the last summer and of summers before that, songs from Chin Chin and The Count of Luxembourg and The Chocolate Soldier. And because the sound of a piano over a stretch of water had always seemed beautiful to Dexter, he lay perfectly quiet and listened. The tune the piano was playing at that moment had been gay and new 5 years before, when Dexter was a sophomore at college. They had played it at a prom once when he could not afford the luxury of proms, and he had stood outside the gymnasium and listened. The sound of the tune precipitated in him a sort of ecstasy, and it was with that ecstasy he viewed what happened to him now. It was a mood of intense appreciation, a sense that for once he was magnificently attuned to life, and that everything about him was radiating a brightness and a glamour he might never know again. A low, pale oblong detached itself suddenly from the darkness of the island, spitting forth the reverberated sound of a racing motorboat. Two white streamers of cleft water rolled themselves out behind it, and almost immediately the boat was beside him, drowning out the hot tinkle of the piano in the drone of its. Dexter, raising himself on his arms, was aware of a figure standing at the wheel, of two dark eyes regarding him over the lengthening space of water. Then the boat had gone by and was sweeping in an immense and purposeless circle of spray round and round in the middle of the lake. With equal eccentricity, one of the circles flattened out and headed back toward the raft. "Who's that?" she called, shutting off her motor. She was so near now that Dexter could see her bathing suit, which consisted apparently of pink rompers. The nose of the boat bumped the raft, and as the latter tilted rakishly, he was precipitated toward her. With different degrees of interest, they recognized each other. "Aren't you one of those men who played through this afternoon?" she demanded. He was. "Well, do you know how to drive a motorboat? Because if you do, I wish you'd drive this one so I can ride on the surfboard behind. My name is Judy Jones." She'd favored him with an absurd smirk, rather, what tried to be a smirk, for twist her mouth as she might, it was not grotesque. It was merely beautiful. "And I live in a house over there on the island, and in that house there is a man waiting for me. When he drove up at the door, I drove out of the dock because he said I'm his ideal." There was a fish jumping and a star shining, and the lights around the lake were gleaming. Dexter sat beside Judy Jones, and she explained how her boat was driven. Then she was in the water, swimming to the floating surfboard with a sinuous crawl. Watching her was without effort to the eyes, watching a branch waving or a seagull flying. Her arms, burned to butternut, moved sinuously among the dull platinum ripples, elbow appearing first, casting the forearm back with a cadence of falling water, then reaching out and down, stabbing a path of head. They moved out into the lake. Turning, Dexter saw that she was kneeling on the low rear of the now up-tilted surfboard. "Go faster," she called, "fast as it'll go." Obediently, he jammed the lever forward, and the white spray mounted at the bow. When he looked around again, the girl was standing up on the rushing board, her arms spread wide, her eyes lifted toward the moon. "It's awful cold," she shouted. "What's your name?" He told her. "Well, why don't you come to dinner tomorrow night?" His head turned over like the flywheel of the boat, and for the second time, her casual whim gave a new direction to his life.